Breaking news. Why does Russia oppose the Black Sea Grains Agreement? This month, Russian President Vladimir Putin accused the West of cheating Moscow by creating obstacles for Russia to overcome in order to export its agricultural products to global markets. As a result, Putin said that Russia was considering withdrawing from the Black Sea grain deal. On Saturday, Putin is scheduled to meet with visiting African leaders to discuss the future of the grain deal. Moscow's invasion of Ukraine and blockade of its Black Sea ports exacerbated a global food crisis, prompting the United Nations and Turkey to broker the Black Sea Grain Initiative in July. It opens the ports of Chornomorsk, Odessa, and Pivdeny, Yuzhny, in Ukraine for the export of food and fertilizer. 3 extensions have been granted, with the most recent one lasting until July 17. Ukraine has exported nearly 32 million tons of mostly corn and wheat so far under the agreement. Ammonia, a vital component of nitrate fertilizer, can be safely exported thanks to the program, but so far none has been sent. In July 2016, the United Nations and Russia signed a 3-year agreement in which the former pledged to assist the latter in resolving any issues that might arise with Russia's ability to transport its own food and fertilizer. While Western sanctions against Russia for its February 2022 invasion of Ukraine do not apply to food and fertilizer exports, Moscow claims that restrictions on payments, logistics, and insurance have acted as a barrier to shipments. Last week, UN spokesman Stefan Dujarric said, "The past months have shown tangible progress, in terms of bettering Russian exports," but he also said, "Challenges remain but we will spare no effort to overcome all remaining obstacles." Rising global food prices had the greatest impact on the world's poor. In March of last year, the UN World Food Programme, WFP, expressed concern that it might not be able to feed 125 million people because half of its grain came from Ukraine. The UN estimates that between 2018 and 2020, Africa will import $3.7 billion in wheat from Russia, 32% of total African wheat imports, and another $1.4 billion from Ukraine, 12% of total African wheat imports. Last year, the United Nations reported that 36 countries, including some of the poorest and most vulnerable, rely on Russia and Ukraine for more than half of their wheat imports. These countries include Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. More than 625,000 tons of grain have been shipped by the WFP under the Black Sea Grain Deal to support relief efforts in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Yemen. In 2022, Ukraine supplied WFP with more than half of the world's wheat grain. Putin claimed the West had cheated Russia because the country's exports were still problematic. The U.S. has ignored Russia's concerns. Linda Thomas Greenfield, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, said last month, "It is exporting grain and fertilizer at the same levels, if not higher, than before the full-scale invasion." Putin claimed that Russia only agreed to the deal for the benefit of African and Latin American nations, but that only 3.2% to 3.4% of the grain actually reaches the world's poorest nations. Approximately 3% of Black Sea exports have gone to low-income countries, 44% have gone to high-income countries, and the remaining 75% have gone to middle-income states, according to data from the United Nations. The United Nations has always maintained that the deal was a commercial venture and not meant to be entirely humanitarian, but that the poorer countries benefited from it because of the global drop in food prices. Russia sent a letter to UN officials with its demands for continued cooperation in the grain deal back in March. The Russian Agricultural Bank, Roskosbank, has been cut off from the SWIFT payment system at the request of Moscow. As a result of Russia's invasion in June of last year, the EU severed ties with the bank's SWIFT service. A spokesperson for the European Union has stated categorically that the EU will not reinstate Russian banks. UN officials, backed by the U.S. government, were able to convince the U.S. bank J.P. Morgan Chase & Company JPM to begin processing payments related to Russian grain exports. The top UN trade official told Reuters last month that the United Nations is collaborating with the African Export-Import Bank, Afreximbank, to develop a platform to facilitate the processing of transactions related to Russian exports of grain and fertilizer to Africa. Togliatti, Russia, to Pivdeni, Ukraine, via pipeline. Russia wants to resume ammonia exports to the Black Sea via these exports. The war halted the pipeline's ability to transport up to 2.5 million tons of ammonia annually. UN officials reportedly proposed in September that Russian fertilizer producer Uralchem sell ammonia to US-based commodities trader Tramo once the gas reached the Russia-Ukraine border. Moscow has announced that it will restrict the number of ships allowed to use the Black Sea grain deal's Pivdeni port until the ammonia pipeline is restarted. According to UN records, it has been over a month since any vessels called on Pivdeni port. Russia has accused Ukrainian forces of bombing the world's longest ammonia pipeline in the Kharkiv region last week. The regional governor of Ukraine accused Russia of shelling the pipeline. There was a lack of proof on both sides. After the outbreak of war, more than 400,000 tons of Russian fertilizer became stuck in EU ports. However, UN officials have negotiated its release for export to Africa. Russia also wants restrictions on insurance and port access lifted for Russian ships and cargo, and for the accounts and financial activities of Russian fertilizer companies to be unblocked. Exports of Russian grain and fertilizer. Since the war, Russia has seen a rise in the export of wheat and a few types of fertilizer, but a dramatic decline in the export of ammonia and potassium-based fertilizers. Russia exported 38.1 million metric tons of grain in the 2021-22 season, including 30.7 million metric tons of wheat. Putin has predicted that Russia will export 55 to 60 million metric tons of grain in the 2022-23 season, which would set a new record. Russian wheat exports to the Middle East and Africa have increased in 2022-2023, as reported by the United States Department of Agriculture. According to trade data, Russian exports of urea, diammonium phosphate, and monoammonium phosphate all increased in 2022, while exports of muriate of potash, MOP, decreased by 37%.